Hi guys, in this video we'll go through this reading comprehension passage and the various questions associated with it. What you could do, and I recommend you do this, is you go through the entire passage and the various questions first on GMAT Club. The link to the GMAT Club passage you'll find along with this video. Go through all the questions, come back, then let me walk you through how I go about reading a reading comprehension passage. And then as one by one I take you through the questions, you could pause the video at that time, try those questions again on your own first, see if your understanding has changed, see if your answer has changed, and then also match your reasoning with mine. That way your learning from this passage will be rich. Let's get into it then. Alright, let's take a look. Exactly when in the early modern era Native Americans began exchanging animal furs with Europeans for European-made goods is uncertain. What's uncertain? Exactly when this thing happened. What thing? Exactly when, in that big period, early modern era, exactly when within that period, Native Americans began exchanging animal furs with Europeans. When did Native Americans begin exchanging animal furs with Europeans for European-made goods? It's uncertain exactly when that happened. Alright. What is fairly certain? Okay, so while the timeline is not exactly certain, there is something which the author seems to be more certain about. Let's see what it is. What is fairly certain, even though they left no written evidence? Oh, certain despite there not being any evidence of having done so. Is that the first Europeans to conduct such trade. What's this such trade referring to? Must be trade of European-made goods with animal furs. What is fairly certain is that the first Europeans to conduct such trade during the modern period were fishing crews working the waters around Newfoundland. First Europeans were fishing crews. Okay. So while the timeline is not certain, who first conducted trade? Fishing crews. Alright, and we're given the area also. Okay. Archaeologists had noticed that 16th century Native American sites were strewn with iron bolts and metal pins. Okay. How does this sentence relate to what we've read so far? I don't see a direct relation yet. Perhaps one will be established later. Only later. Later than what? Later than 16th century, I guess. Let's see. Only later than what? Only later, upon reading Nicholas Dennis's 1672 account of 17th century European settlements in North America, did archaeologists realize that 16th century European fishing crews had dismantled and exchanged parts of their ships for furs. Okay, so only later doesn't say refer to later than 16th century, but archaeologists had noticed something in the past, and only later, upon reading this particular document, did they realize that 16th century European fishing crews had exchanged parts and dismantled parts of their ships for furs. Okay, so these iron bolts and metal pins are perhaps parts of their ships. Alright, and these were perhaps exchanged for furs in 16th century by the fishing crews. Alright. So this happens to be the end of the first paragraph. At this stage, let's recap. Let's summarize what the first paragraph is about. Exactly what the timeline of when Native Americans and Europeans started exchanging furs is unclear. However, what is clear is who first traded in goods made from those furs? Fishing crews. Also, in 16th century sites, there were iron bolts and metal pins found, which we learn could have been parts of ships that fishing crew from Europe brought in, and those guys exchanged these parts for fur. So this last sentence is kind of giving an estimate of that at least the trade perhaps had begun in 16th century or maybe even earlier, right? If that exchange had started or was already present in 16th century sites, perhaps trade had begun by then or maybe even sooner. All right, let's carry on. By the time Europeans first documented the fur trade, it was apparently well underway. By the time these particular Europeans documented the fur trade. So even if, let's say, a document said that fur trade was happening, that wasn't when fur trade would have started. Fur trade was apparently well underway. I wonder why they use the word apparently. Why is it apparent? Maybe they'll answer that question. Let's see. The first to record such trade. What kind of trade? Again, fur trade. The first to record fur trade, the captain of a Portuguese vessel sailing from Newfoundland in 1501, observed that a Native American aboard the ship wore Venetian silver earrings. So this guy, who was a captain of a vessel, observed that a Native American who was on the ship was wearing Venetian. So Venice is in Europe, Venetian silver earrings. So how did this guy who's a Native American get silver earrings from Venice? So perhaps some trade was already happening. Okay. Another early chronicler. Another. Why another? Okay, the first person to chronicle, to write something, to document something was this captain. Now, another early chronicler noted in 1524. Okay, so after 1501, this guy noted in 1524 that Native Americans living along the coast of what is now New England had become selective about European trade goods. They had become selective. How had Native Americans become selective? They accepted only knives, fish hooks, and sharp metal. So far, this paragraph seems to be indicating the timeline. And they had the word apparently well underway. Why was it apparently already well underway? Well, we're learning about that now. The captain, for example, documented in 1501. However, when documenting, he already noted that this Native American was wearing silver earrings from Venice, from Europe. So that indicates that perhaps trade had started even before 1501. That's why in the first sentence they were saying that trade was apparently well underway. And then in the next sentence, another early chronicler noted that in 1524, what happened? Native Americans had become selective about European trade goods. Right? So why would they become selective? Maybe they already had enough of other things. I'm not quite sure why they became selective. There's no reason given like that. However, the Native Americans becoming selective is an indication that trade had been going on already. Let's continue. By the time Cartier sailed the St. Lawrence River 10 years later, Native Americans had traded with Europeans for more than 30 years, perhaps half a century. By the time Cartier sailed the St. Lawrence River 10 years later. 10 years later? So 1524 and then 10 years later, 1534. Okay? By 1534, Native Americans had traded with Europeans for more than 30 years, perhaps half a century. So perhaps trade between Native Americans and Europeans had begun in 1400s. 1534 minus 50 years, that's in 1400s. And perhaps half a century. So there's no clear-cut evidence of this. The author ends with a speculation that perhaps it wasn't even 30 years, it was even more. Perhaps it was 50 years when trade, since when Native Americans had been trading with Europeans. All right, so that happens to be the end of the second paragraph. At this point, Let's first summarize the second paragraph, and since it's the end of the passage as well, we'll then summarize the entire passage. The second paragraph primarily tells us how even the existing documentation doesn't give us an exact timeline of when this fur trade started. However, those documents do indicate that the trade had been going on even before those documents were written. Overall, the passage is about fur trade between Native Americans and Europeans in the early modern era. The first paragraph tells us that the timeline isn't certain. However, who started the trade from the European side? It was fish crew. And what they used initially, or at least for some part of the trade to exchange, were parts of their ships. The passage goes on to tell us about at least when the trade had started using documentation and how those documents indicate that the trade had actually been underway even before those documents were written. Those things are indications. There's no certainty established in terms of when trade began. For example, the authors, in one document, the author mentions how a Native American was wearing European earrings. So that on its own doesn't tell us directly that fur trade was going on before. It's just an indication of that. All right, here's the first question. The author of the passage draws conclusions about the fur trade in North America from all of the following sources except. So, 4 of the answer choices would be sources which the author uses to draw conclusions about the fur trade. One answer choice will not be a source. All right, let's get into it. A. Cartier's account of trading with Native Americans. The author does mention Cartier in the last sentence. By the time Cartier sailed, yep, that's where the author mentions him. However, does the author draw conclusions about the fur trade using his account? No. In fact, the only reason the author mentions Cartier is to state that by the time Cartier did this, so by the time this particular event happened, trade had already been underway for more than 30 years, perhaps even 50 years. That's all. However, the author is not drawing any conclusion about the fur trade using Cartier. This is the right answer. We will not just move on at this stage. Let's continue to eliminate the other answer choices also without any bias. Let's look at the second one. A 17th century account of European settlements. 17th century account? Yep, 1672. This is the 17th century, right? The author does use this guy's account, indicate that fishing crews were some of the first Europeans to conduct fur trade with Native Americans. So this answer choice is wrong. All right, C. A 16th century account written by a sailing vessel captain. Indeed, captain. 1501, right? The author does use this to draw a conclusion about the timeline. 1501 is indeed 16th century, therefore this answer choice is wrong also. Fourth one, archaeological observations of 16th century Native American sites. Yup, mentioned in the first paragraph. Archaeologists had noticed that there were iron bolts and metal pins here, right? So this was a part of how the author figured out that fishing crews were the ones who were doing trade with Native Americans. All right, so this is also used. Last one, a 16th century account of Native Americans in what is now New England. New England, yep, New England was mentioned over here, right? 1524, that's again 16th century. And the author does mention that this other guy in his document, in his chronicle, in 1524, noted that Native Americans had become selective about what they would accept in trade. Right, so this was also part of something that the author used to draw conclusions. So this one is wrong. Also, the correct answer is A. All right, here's the next question. The passage suggests which of the following is partially responsible for the difficulty in establishing the precise date when the fur trade in North America began. What does the passage suggest is partially responsible. For what? For the difficulty in establishing the date. Yep. So the passage starts off with saying exactly when the trade began is uncertain. Right? And then the passage talks about how there's documentation. However, the trade had probably been going on even before the documentation. So what's partially responsible for this difficulty? I can't predict an answer. Right? Let's go through the answer choices. Let's see if then we can figure out what is partially responsible for this difficulty. All right. The first one, a lack of written accounts before that of Nicholas Dennis in 1672. No, there are written accounts before 1672. There is a document from 1501. There's a document from 1524. So this isn't correct. Could this be partially responsible? No. There are written accounts from before 1672. A lack of written documentation before 1501. This makes sense. The first to record such trade was this captain in 1501. So, there weren't documents before 1501, according to the author. So, indeed. And also, the first sentence of the second paragraph says that by the time these specific Europeans first documented the trade, it was apparently well underway. So the documentation began later. This one does make sense. Let's hold on to this. This perhaps is the correct answer, but still let's go through the other answer choices without any bias. Third one, ambiguities in the evidence from Native American sources. Does the passage mention about any evidence from Native American sources? Well, it talks about what's going on at Native American sites and all that. Even if, let's say, we could treat that as evidence from Native American sources, there's no ambiguity related to that. This one is wrong also. Fourth one, uncertainty about Native American trade networks. Remember, what's the question? What is, according to the passage's suggestion, what does the passage suggest is partially responsible for the difficulty? Does the passage ever indicate that Native American trade networks and uncertainty related to those networks is responsible for establishing the date? No. Nothing like this. This one is wrong also. The last one, uncertainty about the origin of artifacts supposedly traded by European fishing crews for furs. Hold on. What we need to figure out is, why was there difficulty in establishing the date of trade between North America and Europe? Fur trade. Whatever Europeans used to trade, those ship parts or whatever, what was the origin of those artifacts? That doesn't matter. Anyway, the passage doesn't suggest this. Right? The passage never suggests that the origin of the artifacts, had we known that, then we could have figured out the date. Plus, even if, let's say, the passage did mention artifacts and let's say the origin of artifacts, think about it. Where did those artifacts originate from? How would that tell us what those artifacts were, or when those artifacts were traded? We don't learn anything about that. This answer choice is wrong also. The correct answer here is B. Okay. Which of the following, if true, most strengthens the author's assertion in the first sentence of the second paragraph? What is the author's assertion in the first sentence of the second paragraph? Let's go and read it. By the time Europeans sailing the Atlantic coast of North America first documented the first trade, it was apparently well underway. What's the assertion? That trade had begun even before documentation began. We know from the second sentence of that paragraph that the first documentation is present in 1501. So basically the assertion is that trade had begun before 1501. That's the assertion we need to support. Before 1501, perhaps in the 1400s. Before 1501. All right. Let's go through the answer choices now. Which one strengthens this assertion? So after learning what, do I believe more that indeed trade had begun before 1501? That's what I need to figure out. All right. The first one, when Europeans retraced Cartier's voyage. So Cartier took a trip, and when Europeans retraced that trip, so when Europeans also went through the same path, I guess, in the first years of the 17th century, okay, they frequently traded with Native Americans. Remember, what do we need to strengthen? We need to strengthen the assertion that trade, the fur trade between North America and Europe had begun before 1501. This answer choice is telling me something that happened in the 17th century, 1600s, way later. Does this strengthen the assertion? Not at all. Next answer choice. Furs from beavers, which were plentiful in North America but nearly extinct in Europe. So furs from certain animals, which were plentiful in North America but not so in Europe, became extremely fashionable in Europe in the final decades of the 16th century. Okay, so this answer choice indicates that perhaps trade was well underway in the final decades of the 16th century. So in the late 1500s. Sure. However, what we need to strengthen is that trade had begun before 1501. Late final decades of 16th century is talking about after 1550. Right? This does not strengthen what needs to be strengthened. Next one, firing arms were rarely found on 16th century Native American sites. Okay? Firing arms, so guns were rarely found on 16th century Native American sites or on European lists of trading goods, since such arms required frequent maintenance and repair. So this answer choice indicates that guns were seldom used for trade. Okay, that's fine. What we need to figure out is what strengthens that trade had begun before 1501. This answer choice only tells us that perhaps guns were not traded. That doesn't help us understand anything about the timeline. The fourth one, Europeans and Native Americans had established trade protocols, such as body language, assuring one another of their peaceful intentions. Okay, Europeans and Native Americans had established certain protocols that antedate, weird word. What does this word antedate mean? That antedate the earliest records of trade. The word antedate means precede. Right? So this sentence means Europeans and Native Americans had established trade protocols that precede the earliest records of trade. What are the earliest records of trade? The first to record such trade was this captain in 1501. Now in option D, we learn that these two groups, the Europeans and Native Americans, had established trade protocols even before 1501. So perhaps then fur trade had begun before 1501. This one does strengthen the assertion. This should be correct. We'll still go through the last one without any bias. During the first quarter of the 16th century, first quarter of 16th century, so 1500 to 1525. What happened during this period? An Italian explorer recorded seeing many Native Americans with what appeared to be copper beads, though the copper beads may have been made of indigenous copper. So local copper, American copper. Then what's the big deal? Anyway, the timeline here is the first quarter of 16th century. So anyway, this pretty much is after 1501. Plus, also what's documented is that these guys had copper beads, but the copper itself could be local copper, could be American copper. So anyway, this thing doesn't indicate about trade. And plus the timeline is, even if this statement did indicate trade, the timeline is after 1501. So this option is wrong also. The correct answer is D. Now realize the key to getting this answer correct was first spending time with the question. For example, here the question was, which one most strengthens the author's assertion? Then I went and read the assertion in the first sentence of the second paragraph. But I didn't even end there. After reading the assertion was that by the time Europeans documented the fur trade, it was already underway. It was apparently well underway. I didn't even stop there. I then went on to confirm, when did Europeans first document the fur trade? I got that answer in the second sentence. They first documented the fur trade in 1501. And therefore, what I was then looking for was something that supported or strengthened the assertion that the fur trade between North America and Europe had begun before 1501. Once I had that clarity, it was very easy for me to go through the answer choices and realize which ones were incorrect and which one was correct. Option B, for example, is the most commonly selected answer here. However, option B talks about what happened in the final decades of the 16th century. So how does this strengthen that trade had begun before 1501? It doesn't strengthen that at all. Option D, while doesn't directly talk about fur trade, it only talks about trade protocols. Option D does highlight that perhaps some form of trade had begun before 16th century, before 1501, yeah. And by doing that, it strengthens the author's assertion. Now, it's also important here that we understand what the word strengthen means. Right? We anyway deal with this in critical reasoning. Strengthen does not mean we need to confirm the author's assertion. Strengthen doesn't mean we need to confirm that fur trade had begun before 1501. Strengthen means that we need to increase our confidence in that assertion. Now that we learn that trade protocols had been established before 1501, my confidence goes up that, perhaps fur trade had begun before 1501. And that's exactly what strengthen means. Compared with before, my confidence in the assertion is now higher. For this question, anyway, I can accept that maybe you're unclear about why D is correct, right? You're unsure about what strengthen really means. You might be thinking that, D is anyway not talking about fur trade specifically. I get that. However, even then, why would you select B as the correct answer, or any other answer choice for that matter? All the other answer choices, the first one is talking about something in the 17th century, the second one is talking about the second half of the 16th century, the third one anyway is not talking about trade, it's just saying firing arms were not used, they were rarely found, and they were not used for these reasons, whatever. The fifth one also is talking about the first quarter of the 16th century. All these answer choices are talking about things that happened after 1501. So anyway, they can't be correct. All right. Which of the following best describes the primary function of lines 11 through 16? Lines 11 through 16, I've highlighted those here. All right, let's go through those. Only later, upon reading this guy's account, did the archaeologist realize that, all right, the fishing crews had used parts of their ships for exchange, trading with furs. And how's that relevant? Later than what? Let's read the previous sentence also. Archaeologists had noticed that 16th century Native American sites were strewn with iron bolts and metal pins. Okay, so archaeologists noticed that those old sites had iron bolts. And then later, on reading this guy's document, the archaeologists realized that, okay, the fishing crews had used ship parts, so perhaps iron bolts and metal pins, to trade with fur. this statement relates with the previous one. In the previous one, we just knew standalone that archaeologists had noticed iron bolts in Native American sites. We now learn the significance that, okay, the fishing crews used to use ship parts to trade. Alright, let's move on to the answer choices. It offers, so this sentence, it offers a reconsideration of a claim made in the previous sentence. What's the previous sentence? Archaeologists had noticed that 16th century Native American sites were strewn with iron bolts and metal pins. So firstly, is this a claim? No, this is what archaeologists had noticed. It's pretty factual. Anyway, does the next statement offer a reconsideration of this claim? No. It builds further. It's not asking us to reconsider anything. The last sentence of this paragraph, the highlighted portion, is not changing our understanding of what's mentioned in the previous sentence. There's nothing that needs to be reconsidered. This answer choice is wrong. The next one, it reveals how archaeologists arrived at an interpretation of the evidence mentioned in the previous sentence. Okay, let's take it part by part. Is the previous sentence evidence? Indeed it is. Right? There is evidence mentioned in the previous sentence. These guys had noticed that 16th century sites had iron bolts and metal pins. But then that on its own didn't mean anything. Afterwards, when the archaeologists learned through this guy's account that those iron bolts and metal pins were perhaps what the fishing crews from Europe had used to trade. Now it all fits in. So indeed, the last sentence reveals how archaeologists arrived at an interpretation of the evidence. Right? So based on that overall, perhaps then they understood, okay, so fishing crews used to trade. Fishing crews from Europe used to trade with Native Americans for fur. So this one is correct. Let's hold on to this. We still need to go through the other answer choices without any bias. The third one, it shows how scholars misinterpreted the significance of certain evidence mentioned in the previous sentence. Hold on. There is evidence mentioned in the previous sentence. However, did scholars misinterpret that the significance of that evidence? No. So the last sentence doesn't show how scholars misinterpreted the significance of evidence. No, nothing like that. Next one, it identifies one of the first significant accounts of 17th century European settlements in North America. Remember, what's the objective here? To figure out the primary function of this portion. Anyway, we can wonder whether it is one of the first significant accounts of 17th century European settlements. We don't know that. There could very well be other significant accounts before this one. Even if, let's say, somehow we believe that fine, Nicholas Dennis did have one of the first accounts of 17th century European settlements in North America. Fine, even if we accept that. The question is, what is the primary function of these lines? Is the primary function of this sentence to identify one of the first accounts? No. The primary function is to relate this with what archaeologists had found in sites and then overall link that with trade between Native Americans and Europeans. So this is certainly not the primary function. The last answer choice, it explains why Dennis's account of 17th century European settlements is thought to be significant. Is this the primary function? Is this why the last sentence is written? To explain why his account is thought to be significant? No. It is significant. However, the sentence is not written to explain why Dennis's account is thought to be significant. There's no reasoning like that here. Why it's significant is because it helps relate with the previous sentence as to those iron bolts and metal pins found in 16th century American sites perhaps indicate that trade had already been going on in the 16th century between European fishing crews and Native Americans. That's all. E is incorrect as well. The correct answer is B. All right. It can be inferred from the passage that the author would agree with which of the following statements about the fur trade between Native Americans and Europeans in the early modern era. Okay, so what can be inferred that the author would agree with? All right, it's a pretty vague question yet, right? What can be inferred, what can't be inferred? Well, in terms of timeline, it can't be inferred that trade started only after 1501, for example, right? The author, in fact, believes that trade had begun before. Also, that trade had begun with fishing crews trading with Native Americans, and trade perhaps also happened for some ornaments initially, at least, right? Silver earrings and everything. Okay, let's head on to the answer choices. This trade, what trade? Fur trade. This trade may have begun as early as the 1480s. Look at the wording, may have begun. The inference is not that the trade had definitely begun in the 1480s. No, this trade may have begun. And in fact, in the last sentence of the passage, the author does mention that Native Americans had traded with Europeans for more than 30 years. More than 30 years? From when? 10 years. So 10 years later is 1524 plus 10, 1534. And then, in the end, the author is saying Native Americans had traded with Europeans for more than 30 years, perhaps half a century. So 1534 minus 50, 1480 something, 1484, right? So indeed, trade may have begun as early as the 1480s. Indeed, the author would agree with this. Yes, this is correct. Let's look at the next answer choice. This trade, the fur trade, probably did not continue much beyond the 1530s. Can this be inferred from the passage? Well, no, there's nothing like that. Anyway, for example, we have two documents from 1501, 1524. There's a document from 1617 too, which also talks about trade. Even if somehow we accept that this 1672 document was written as a historical account, even then, when did the trade end? There's no indication about that. Can it be inferred that the author would agree that trade did not continue much beyond 1530s? No, that can't be inferred. When did the trade end? There's no indication about that in the passage. Okay, this trade was most likely at its peak in the 1520s. Similar reasoning to the previous one. When was trade at its peak? We don't know. The author is talking about when the trade began. It's uncertain what indicates when the trade began and all that. When was the trade at its peak? When did the trade end? The author doesn't talk about either of these two things. This trade probably did not begin prior to 1500. This one directly is contradicted by the passage. The author, in fact, says that perhaps trade had begun half a century before 1534. So this one is categorically wrong. There is no written evidence of this trade prior to the 17th century. There's evidence starting from 1501. This one is wrong also. The correct answer here is A. Which of the following can be inferred from the passage about the Native Americans mentioned in line 25? Right? The highlighted portion, line 25, doesn't directly mention Native Americans. So let's start reading the entire sentence from the beginning. Another early chronicler noted in 1524 that Native Americans living along the coast of what is now New England had become selective about European trade goods. Okay, so in this chronicle, in this document, we read that Native Americans living in this particular region had become selective about trade goods. Selective. They accepted only knives, fish hooks, and sharp metal. They did not accept other things. All right, understood. What's the question which can be inferred about Native Americans? About these guys living on the coast of what is now New England. Let's see. They had little use for decorative objects such as earrings. They did not accept from Europeans earrings. However, can we infer that anyway Native Americans did not have use, or they had little use for earrings, such objects? That's a bit too far. Maybe they use earrings, but maybe they procure them themselves or make them themselves. They don't procure them for trade, at least, not for fur trade. So can we infer that overall they had little use for these objects? No, we can't infer that. They became increasingly dependent on fishing between 1501. Increasingly dependent. Do we know that their dependence increased? No. Maybe they were dependent on fishing earlier also. Maybe they did fishing using some other means earlier. Or maybe they had knives, fishhooks before also, but they needed more of these. So has their dependence increased? We can't comment on that. By 1524, only certain groups of Europeans were willing to trade with them. No, hold on. The highlighted portion is talking about selectivity of Native Americans. This is not indicating any selectivity on the part of Europeans. So who was willing to trade, who wasn't willing to trade from the European side, we don't know anything about that. This can't be inferred. Next one, the selectivity of their trading choices made it difficult for them. Who's this them? The Native Americans who lived on this coast. This selectivity made it difficult for them to engage in widespread trade with Europeans. We don't know that. Were Europeans readily willing to trade knives and fishhooks and sharp metal or not? We have no idea. Can this be inferred? No. The last one, the selectivity of their trading choices indicates that they had been trading with Europeans for a significant period of time prior to 1524. Yeah. Now, there are two reasons for why this answer choice is correct. I'll highlight both. The first is that overall, the second paragraph starts with saying that fur trade was apparently well underway by the time trade was documented. So to explain that, to elaborate on that, the author uses two examples. The first is an example of 1501. The second is an example of 1524. Right? So both these examples are used to highlight, to support that trade had begun even before documentation had started. So that's one reason why we can understand that, yes, Native Americans had this selectivity. This whole thing indicates that, yes, they had been trading with Europeans even before 1524. Now, let's go deeper. What does this selectivity indicate? Selectivity. They were selective. Right? So, perhaps initially they were willing to accept anything, but after a while they became more and more selective. Now, you might wonder, but how can we be so sure? First of all, anyway, the inference is that the selectivity indicates this thing. The answer choice is not saying the selectivity shows that this happened. It's just an indication. And there is actually some hint about that. Where is that hint? That hint is there in the previous sentence also. In 1501, a Native American was seen wearing European silver earrings. So maybe they had been trading other things before. Right? In 1524, however, these particular Native Americans had become selective. So, trade had perhaps been going on even before, when Native Americans did trade earrings and such things also with Europeans. But at this point, these specific Native Americans had become selective. They did not trade for any of those things. The correct answer to this question is E. This selectivity is also linked with what's mentioned in the first paragraph. I'll take you over here. In the first paragraph, the author talks about how in the 16th century, European fishing crews used ship parts to trade. Now we learn over here that these Native Americans in this particular region had become selective. They accepted only knives, fish hooks, and sharp metal. So perhaps they did not accept iron bolts and some of the other ship parts. Right? Since the ship parts had been found earlier, so this selectivity does indicate that trade had been going on even before. It's not like trade when it began with knives and fish hooks. No, trade had been going on before also. Earlier, perhaps earrings had been traded as mentioned here, and earlier perhaps other things had been traded as mentioned here, and later on they became selective and accepted only knives, fish hooks, and sharp metal. So indeed, this selectivity does indicate that the trade had been going on even before 1524. E is the correct answer. Alright, the passage supports which of the following statements about 16th century European fishing crews working the waters of Newfoundland? Newfoundland is mentioned over here, right? Fishing crews, yep. So the author does say that even though they left no written evidence, what is certain is that the first Europeans to conduct such trade during the modern period were fishing crews in this region. Okay, and then the author goes on to elaborate on why they think so, right? Because ship parts had been exchanged according to these documents, and in the 16th century sites, those ship parts had been found. All right. Now, what is supported about these fishing crews? Let's get into the answer choices. They wrote no accounts of their fishing voyages. This one might seem tempting because we are given that even though they left no written evidence. So they left no written evidence. Does that mean that they did not write any accounts of fishing voyages? Well, two things here. One, this answer choice is talking about fishing voyages. Whereas in the passage what we are given is that they left no evidence of having done so. Having done what? Having done trade, right? That's what the previous sentence is about. Exactly when the early modern era North Americans began exchanging. Having done so, having exchanged animal furs. So the passage mentions that even though they've left no written evidence of fur trade, whereas option A is talking about they wrote no accounts of their fishing voyages, which is a much broader term. Do we know that? No. Also, even if let's say this answer choice instead of fishing voyages talked about fur trade, even then they've left no written evidence. Maybe they wrote and then it got burnt or it got thrown down the ship into the sea or whatever. Did they not even write? We can't say that. Right? There's no evidence now. There's no written evidence now. Did they never even write such accounts? We can't say that. So this answer choice is wrong. They primarily sailed under the flag of Portugal. We don't know that. Does the passage support this? No. They exchanged ship parts with Native Americans for furs. Aha! That's what the last two sentences of the first paragraph are about. Right? Iron bolts and metal pins were found in Native American sites in the 16th century Native American sites, and according to Nicholas Dennis, fishing crews had used ship parts to exchange for fur. So indeed, this one fits. Next one, they commonly traded jewelry with Native Americans. Nope. We know they perhaps traded ship parts. Did they commonly trade jewelry? There's nothing to support this. The passage does not support this. They carried surplus metal implements to trade with Native Americans. Well, we know that they perhaps traded metal with Native Americans. Was it surplus metal? Or did they just take out parts from their ship to trade? Right? Was it surplus or not? We have no idea. The correct answer here is C. Which of the following can be inferred from the passage about evidence pertaining to the fur trade between Native Americans and Europeans in the early modern era? Okay. What can be inferred about the evidence? What evidence? Well, there's a bunch of evidence, that these documents, what the archaeologists found and all that. Let's see what the answer choices talk about. A lack of written evidence has made it difficult to establish which Europeans first participated in this trade. The author seems pretty clear. He's fairly certain that the first Europeans to conduct such trade were fishing crews. So can it be inferred that this lack of written evidence has made it difficult to establish who first participated in this trade? No. The author is pretty clear about that. In general, the physical evidence pertaining to this trade has been more useful than the written evidence. There is physical evidence, right? What they found in 16th century sites. There is written evidence. There's Nicholas Dennis's account. There's this 1501 captain's account. There's 1524 document. All these things. What is more important, right? What has been more useful? We can't say. Both these things have been useful. What's been more useful? We can't infer anything like that. This one's wrong also. There is more written evidence pertaining to this trade from the early part of the 16th century. So before 1550, 1500 to whatever, early part of the 16th century than from later in that century. So 1550 onwards, I guess. Is there more evidence from the initial part of the 16th century than the later part of the 16th century? Well, the passage does mention two documents from 1501 and 1524. However, these documents are primarily written to highlight how trade had begun even before these initial documents. These documents do not indicate that there was no documentation later on. Right? So there very well could have been more documentation later as well. Can we infer about this evidence that there's more evidence from the first half of the 16th century than the second half? No, we can't infer that. The earliest written evidence pertaining to this trade, to the fur trade, dates back from a time when the trade was already well established. The earliest evidence, 1501, dates from a time when the trade was already well established. If I read the previous sentence, by the time Europeans sailing the Atlantic coast first documented the fur trade was apparently well underway. So in 1501, the trade was perhaps already well underway. Indeed. So the earliest written evidence dates from a time when the trade was already well established. Yes, this can be inferred about the evidence. Indeed. Let's look at the last one. Some important pieces of evidence pertaining to this trade, such as Dennis's 1672 account, were long overlooked by archaeologists. So archaeologists did only later read Dennis's account and realize that the significance of those iron bolts and metal pins found at the 16th century site. So did the archaeologists only read that later? Yes. However, were they long overlooked? I can't say that. Right? Were these pieces of evidence long overlooked? I can't infer that. E is incorrect as well. The correct answer for this question is D. The passage suggests which of the following about the 16th century Native Americans who traded with Europeans on the coast of what is now called New England. Okay, so those guys are talked about here, how they were selective, how they had become selective, how they only accepted knives, fishhooks, and sharp metal. All right, so I recollect what Native Americans are being talked about. The question is, what does the passage suggest about these guys? Let's see. Option A, by 1524, they had become accustomed to exchanging goods with Europeans. By 1524, that's when the document was written, they had become accustomed. That seems logical, right? They had become accustomed because they could now choose. They were now very selective. No. We don't just want anything. We want very specific items. We want knives, we want fishhooks, we want sharp metal, nothing else. Also, anyway, trade had been going on with Native Americans before also, right? So the passage does suggest that by this year, these guys had become accustomed. Yeah, this one looks pretty good. Let's hold on to it. The next one, they were unfamiliar with metals before encountering Europeans. Whoa, that's a huge jump. They want sharp metal from Europeans. Does that suggest that they were unfamiliar with metals and that's why they wanted sharp metal from Europeans? No. They didn't have enough perhaps, but can we say that they were unfamiliar completely with metals? We can't say that. Next one, they had no practical uses for European goods other than metals and metal implements. They had no practical uses. Okay. These guys were selective. They only wanted these things. Does that mean they had no uses at all for other things, for other European goods? No, it's possible they had more use of these things and they had use of other things also, just not as much. Does the passage suggest that they had no practical uses for other European goods? The passage does not suggest that. This is wrong. The next one, by 1524, they had become disdainful of European traders because such traders had treated them unfairly in the past. Had these guys become disdainful? Is that why they became selective? There's no indication of that. They were selective. Were they selective because of their needs, because of their disdain? There's nothing like that mentioned in the passage, right? Nothing at all along the lines of these guys being disdainful of European traders. This is wrong. E, by 1524, they demanded only the most prized European goods because they had come to realize how valuable furs were on European markets. All right, so they were selective. They wanted only knives, fishhooks, and sharp metal. Did they want these three things because they had a higher need? Or they wanted these things because these were the most prized things for Europeans? We don't know that, right? We know they were selective. Does the passage suggest that they were selective and they were selective for these three things because these were the most prized European goods? There's no suggestion in that direction. This answer choice is wrong as well. The correct answer here is A. Hope these explanations made sense. In case you have any questions, please leave a comment. I'll try and get back to you.